Hello, welcome to the Flute 360 podcast, where we incorporate a panoramic view of flute-related topics. I am your host, Heidi K. Begay, and this is episode 53, Tips for Doublers with Jon Rice.
This is Paula Mims from Texas Flute Society. I am so excited to invite you to our 2021 Virtual Flute Festival on May 6th through 8th, 2021. Our guest artists are Jennifer Grimm, Jennifer Gunn, George Pope, Yi Xiong, and Brian Allred. The virtual festival will feature our annual competitions, Myrna W. Brown Artist Competition, Donna Marie Harry Young Artist Competition, and the Masterclass Competition. We're also hosting a virtual solo ensemble for flutists of every level to play for a professional clinician and receive feedback. This year, we are offering the option of playing on live video or sending in a recording. The virtual festival has a total of 31 events, which include 7 flute choirs and various workshops and recitals. For more information about the festival, please visit our website or find us on Facebook and Instagram. We hope to see you at the Texas Flute Society Virtual Flute Festival on May 6th through 8th, 2021.
Welcome everyone to another Flute 360 podcast episode. Today we are talking with Jon Rice, who is a DMA candidate at Texas Tech University in Lubbock. Welcome, Jon.
Thanks for having me on, Heidi.
Yeah, for sure. So for those who don't know, Jon and I are actually really great friends and went to school at Texas Tech. So it only felt natural to ask not only a beautiful musician and an expert in the field of doubling, but also a friend. So it's a nice combination.
Yeah, I think so too. And what, Heidi won't tell you either is that we are also alum of the University of Arizona.
That is right. We didn't go to school at the same time, but that's how I actually approached him fall of 2015 in the yoga class we took with Dr. Lisa Garner-Santa. I saw a big old A on his backpack, and I said, oh my gosh, you went to the school at the University of Arizona. What year? And so Jon got his master's there. What year did you graduate?
2014.
Oh my gosh. I graduated with my undergrad in 2007. So we kind of missed each other there.
Just a small window.
Yeah. But we don't want to say age or numbers or anything, so I think we need to put that to bed.
We've got more important things to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, shoot. So is it beautiful in Lubbock today?
It actually is very beautiful in Lubbock today. It's right around 72 degrees, and I'm thinking about squeezing in a run for the first time in a week as soon as we get done with this podcast episode.
Yeah, well, when we get done with this podcast episode, I'm going to force Eric to get out of the office and we're going to go for a hike because it's probably 72 degrees over here, also in Fort Worth, and it's just gorgeous.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yep, gotta be outside.
You have to. I mean, if you're not outside, you're doing yourself a disservice. Thankfully, you can listen to this podcast outside.
That is right. That's a beautiful public announcement. Thank you for that. Well, you only really need, for they say levels of vitamins and such, for your vitamin D levels, you really only need 5 to 10 minutes outdoors to get the right amount of vitamin D that you need for the day.
I believe that.
Yeah. So, people take vitamin D through vitamins, the pills, but actually you really don't even need that. The body can't absorb it the right way. The best way to absorb vitamin D is the sun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Superman gets his energy, and that's how I get mine.
Perfect. So, talking about doubling today, and this idea was insane because I love it when topics arise in my music personal life very organically, and this is one of them. So, even before you text messaged me about a month ago, I was seeing a lot of issues with my students going from orchestra to jazz band to wind band on these different instruments. And one of them, a student in particular, Olivia, she plays in 5 different bands on 5 different instruments. And so I was starting to see this issue come up. And then somebody approached me, and he was a saxophonist as well. And he came to me for lessons for flutes because he wanted to be hired for musicals. So I saw that trend come in my life. And then you texted me and said, when are you going to do a topic on doubling? And I thought, okay, well, this just has to happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for the suggestion and thank you for your time today.
Oh, of course. Well, it's something that, it doesn't get talked about a lot, especially, and I remember when I was in my undergrad, I was not necessarily talked out of, going a doubling route. But on the other hand, I did have teachers who, wholly supported that. And I'm really glad that I listened to them because it's really expanded my career, I guess I should say. It's got me doubling has gotten me a lot more gigs than just, legit saxophone playing or just jazz saxophone playing.
I remember back in high school with my first teacher, Catherine Witt Reinhardt, I remember asking about doubling and picking up other instruments. And she's like, of course, this was like 20 years ago. But she said, well, you don't really have to do that unless you're going to be a band director. And so I just totally dismissed the idea because I knew in my head and my mind for my future career, I wasn't going to be a band director. But little did I know, there's other options out there other than just that niche.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting too, the other area of my life where I have seen it come up is job announcements.
Absolutely. Especially for saxophonists. I've applied for a couple of different jobs already, in the last couple of weeks. But every other job that I've applied for in the past has always been, we need auxiliary type of instruction, either flute and clarinet, flute and bassoon and oboe, whatever it is, in addition to, saxophone. And then on top of that, most of them also want somebody who can play jazz as well. So you're taking, a job for, 5-6 people and you're condensing it all into one. It's the whole why hire more when we can hire one person to do the whole thing kind of mindset. And it's understandable. It's great for guys like me, but, not so great for the folks who can, just do one. And now granted, those folks who can do just one, they can do that one thing a whole lot better than I can, Mm-hmm. But, that's the sort of give and take with doubling is, you become a jack of all trades, but a master of none, so to speak.
Yeah. And since we have that University of Arizona connection, just throwing this out there, I remember Brian Luce back in 2003 saying that, he foresees more job postings being announced for woodwind professors. Like you said, why hire 6 people when one person can do all 6? And he said, I can see this trend of, a specialist in just flute or just oboe or clarinet, whatever the case may be, diminish, and then they're going to hire one person to fill 6 spots. And so sure enough, there are so many announcements right now on Musical Chairs, the website, in case you all haven't heard of it before, where I've had to not even consider or even submit an application because I know I'm not qualified. There's an academy out in China called the Mint Academy, and also one, I saw a job posting out in Reading, UK for a woodwind specialist, but they were looking for somebody also then who knows all the woodwinds but specializes in flute. But that was out in an academy out in England. And, sure enough, I'm not going to waste the committee's time, but it's interesting to see these posts announced.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think a common misconception that some people might have about, when applying for these jobs, they want someone who can play, Mozart's Clarinet Concerto or, the Ingolf Dahl Concerto for saxophone. I think that they're, they might be looking for folks who play this really, really difficult rep, when I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think if you have a good understanding of fundamentals of the instrument, then, you can kind of teach them where to go from there. It's just kind of like, teaching it. You're not going to make this person a 5-star player. You'll give them the tools to do that, but ultimately it's up to them how much they practice, that sort of thing.
I think that's a really good point to make, because I think I had that at some point misconception in my own head by you just saying, oh, well, you're going to have to play, the Iber Concerto, which is a very difficult, challenging flute piece.
Right.
But for you just to kind of lay out those misconceptions and debunk those myths, I think is good for students to hear.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, like currently I'm working on a Handel sonata for flute, right? And it's not the most difficult piece in the world, but playing with good fundamentals is absolutely everything in my opinion. Playing with good sound, good articulation, good shaping of the line. That's another completely, different episode altogether. And then also with other fundamental sort of things like scales and long tones and patterns and stuff like that. I mean, that's all stuff that you can do. You don't necessarily need to be shown that, by the time you're 20 or 21. Theoretically, you would have already, started those patterns on your main instrument. All you have to do is just transfer them over to your secondary, which is, sounds a lot easier than what it might, the execution might be actually, but it's really not that bad. And that's hopefully what we can dive into later.
Yeah, for sure. And since you mentioned some of these instruments you play on, let's backtrack a little bit. And you've touched base that primarily you are a saxophonist. Could you give the audience a little bit of your background so they know musically where you're coming from? And I don't know, tell them about Oklahoma and all that good stuff.
Of course, absolutely. So I grew up in very rural Oklahoma, Chico, for anybody who is listening that might know where that might be, just about an hour south of Tulsa. And, our budget there was not necessarily in dire need, but we weren't necessarily overflowing with cash either. So, our band director at the time, I believe he's still there, Mr. Jim Davis. I credit absolutely everything that I have today to him for showing me that, hard work really does pay off if you invest the time into it. So I started out playing saxophone in 5th grade. Fun fact, I was almost a tubist because they did an instrumental demonstration when we were in 4th grade, right before we transitioned into 5th. And I was just like, man, that thing's kind of a behemoth. I kind of want to play that. And then, I brought that idea home to my parents, and they're like, "Oh, you don't want to play something, kind of cool like, saxophone? You don't want to play tuba." No offense to any tubists out there. Some of the greatest guys I've ever known and gals throughout my career have been tuba players, but it just wasn't for me. So yes, I picked up saxophone, and it was, it was just kind of like a love at first sight sort of thing. I took to it, quickly. It was not necessarily a challenge for me moving forward. So yeah, it wasn't necessarily hours and hours of practice when I was in 5th grade, more like 15 to 30 minute increments, just because I was very curious about the instrument, how it worked, how it made all these different fun sounds. So that's where I really, really started to fall in love with it. Fast forward a couple of years to 7th grade, my band director at the time, he kind of noticed that I was picking up a little bit of steam, and he said, "Hey, if you'd like to play in the high school band, you can, even though you're in 7th grade, but it would have to be on bass clarinet." And I said, "Well, okay, what's the deal with bass clarinet?" I had no idea. And he's like, "Well, the fingering system is actually quite similar, but here's a book and here's a bass clarinet if you're interested." So I said, okay. So I took the book home and I made a photocopy of the fingering chart, and it was like sitting there with the music, writing the fingerings above the notes. And it was just kind of, that's just kind of how I practiced and how I learned it. And then, it got to the point where, okay, we've got enough bass clarinets now. How would you like to do contrabass clarinet? Which was a lot of fun. No new fingering system or anything. It was just, I got to lug around a 50-pound hunk of metal that vaguely sounded like a really low bass clarinet. But that's neither here nor there. So I played bass clarinet in high school band for my 7th grade year, and then my 8th grade, right at the tail end of my 7th grade year, I remember wrestling around with that contrabass clarinet. I was like, I'm kind of done with this. I'm over this. I noticed somebody, I can't remember his name. He was playing bassoon, and I was very curious as to what that thing was. So I asked my band director, I said, "Hey, again, I can't remember his name." I said, "What's he playing?" He said, "Oh, he's playing the bassoon." I said, "I want to play that." And he said, "Well, okay, I know nothing about it, but, go and get a bassoon out of the stock room, and here's a book, good luck." And I did the exact same thing I did with bass clarinet, meaning I photocopied the fingering chart, and then I just kind of started reading. And this was a beginner book. So, I mean, I really, really kind of just started right at the beginning. And that's just kind of how I learned bassoon. Was
nice.
Very, very, very slow, low intensity type practice. And again, it just kind of took off. The more you do something, the better you get at it. That's an interesting theory, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So that's where I learned, to play bassoon. I learned a new clef for that because I was so used to reading treble. I started playing bass more often. And I played bassoon. I still play bassoon, as a matter of fact. I played bassoon all the way up until I started my undergraduate degree at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, where I was principal bassoonist from 2006 until 2012. I took a couple of years off when I was at Arizona because that was, I thought I'd printed out the music and was going to audition for the orchestra, and then I realized, oh, this is for actual bassoonists, not bastardized ones. I just said, okay, I'll take a little bit of a break. And then when I got to Lubbock, I was fortunate enough to have gotten called about doubling things, just because, playing in jazz ensemble, mainly jazz ensemble, is, where we get to show off our flute and clarinet chops a little bit. Word of mouth gets around, and then I always love to surprise people when I say, oh, well, I play, bassoon and oboe also. And they go, oh, wow. Well, that's amazing. So, and that's kind of what I've been doing since I've been in Lubbock. A lot of bassoon playing, a lot of saxophone playing, a lot of doubling in general. But back to, I never really got to, how I got into flute was when I was in high school. We played some challenging enough music to where, there were double parts in our high school jazz ensemble library. And one called for flute, playing lead alto. You play a lot of flute. That was just kind of something that I, came to find out. And one of my friends, she was in band with me for a few years, and then she decided, really wasn't her thing. So she let me borrow her flute. And again, like with clarinet and bassoon, took a book home and just kind of started going to work. I found out that clarinet, flute, and saxophone all share a very similar fingering system. So that made things a lot easier because my thinking was, oh, okay, if I can play, a G to a D on saxophone, I can play a G to a D on flute, no problem, with the exception of one little tweak. Or it was just like weird little connections like that I would make in my brain that made sense to me. Now, saying this to all you listeners out there, you might be going, oh my gosh, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. He must be going to the nut house nowadays. It's finding connections within the instruments and kind of just rolling with those. I think that really made sense to me. The thing I love about bassoon is none of the fingerings are similar whatsoever. So that kind of helps keep it completely separate from the other three.
Yeah, no, that's a great background. And just the word that I took away from all of that was something you mentioned, and I love it, curiosity. It seemed like you were really curious about, this instrument, that instrument, how are they similar? How are they different? And I think, I'm not a doubler, but I would think that you would have to have some sort of curiosity in order to take interest in learning all the instruments that you have learned.
Right, yeah. And it's kind of interesting because I've spoken with saxophonists who have, little to no experience in, let's say, for instance, flute, right? And, they'll be like, man, I can't, you actually sound fairly decent on that. Like, how do you do that? And I was like, well, here, give it a shot. And I mean, you would have thought that I was handing them, the world's most venomous snake or something. I mean, it's kind of funny. It's like, well, I mean, it's an inanimate object. Number one, it's not going to hurt you, much less bite you and kill you.
The flute bites me every day, so I can understand that look of what.
Right. Yeah. So I'm just like, no, it's okay. You got to play the horn. Don't let the horn play you.
Yeah.
So
no, I love that.
It's a curiosity thing, and also you can't defeat yourself before you even start.
Right. That's wonderful advice. But even with our primary instruments, just take doubling out of the equation. Just with our normal instruments, I mean, how many times, do we get into a rut and practicing becomes boring or, uninteresting? And it's like, well, there's something wrong if it's boring. And so you have to pull out of that magic hat that curiosity and that sense of wonderment like a young child to find that magic. Because, I mean, it's no fun to practice if it's boring.
Oh, absolutely not. And usually, I mean, I find that when I'm starting to get bored, I'll change up the pattern that I'm working. That usually helps, or that usually, leads to frustration, and then I just don't want to play at all anymore that day, Or my third option, my third go-to is I'll switch horns. I'll be like, okay, you know what? I've done enough work on saxophone today. Let's get clarinet out. And then all of a sudden you're kind of faced with some different problems. And then that's where it's like, oh, okay, well, how can I fix this? This is something new. It's similar, but it's very different at the same time. So it's kind of like it's stimulating a different part of your brain that kind of re-engages you.
Yep, exactly. Again, this series is great for it to be a resource for people. And maybe, who knows, I'll pick up the clarinet or saxophone and just, get messy and play some. But going into this as a very newbie, my first instinct as a teacher, as an educator, as a performer, I'm thinking it would have to help with coordination. It would have to help with, like you said, approaching the instrument a little differently because, say, a melody sits very well. I don't know, I'm just rambling or just guessing here. Like maybe there's a clarinet solo in a Brahms symphony, right? That sits really well, beautifully for clarinet. Have you ever tried taking that solo and then playing it on flute? Because I would guess then it wouldn't sit as well, or there might be different tendencies here or there, and then you're like, oh, and you learn something from that switch. The Straubinger Flute Company is a sought-out maker of fine flutes and pats. Located in Indianapolis, Indiana, the company celebrated their 50th anniversary in 2018. The Straubingers contribute to the community with new ideas, concepts, and raise the bar to new heights for all flutists. Straubinger flutes are known for their brilliant mechanism, beautiful tone colors, and outstanding craftsmanship. If you would like more information about Straubinger flutes, please visit their website at straubingerflutes.com.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe not quite to that extent, but I will say this, and it's very funny that you bring this up. So last November, I played The Wizard of Oz, and I played saxophone, flute, and clarinet. And there was a passage in there on clarinet, written specifically for clarinet, the tempo that it was at, number one, and the placement of the notes. It was going right over the break. I mean, it was a nightmare. And I asked, our resident clarinet player, and she teaches at Plainview. I said, hey, even for an accomplished clarinetist like yourself, how does this passage right here make you feel? And I showed her my music, and she said, that sucks. She's like, I don't know what I would do, but I would almost take it up an octave or something. I would not play it right there. So I kind of scratched my head a little bit, and I was like, well, I could take it up an octave. That would kind of it would stick out way too much. But I have a soprano saxophone, same register, same key, and it's going to be a heck of a lot easier if I play it on soprano saxophone than if I tried to play it on clarinet. So what I did, and they have a similar timbre almost. Soprano, almost kind of sounds more like an oboe at times. The way that it was mixed in with the orchestra, it didn't really matter as long as that moving chromatic line was there. I mean, first off, the audience is there to see the folks sing and dance on stage. They're not here to see us, right? Mm-hmm. Secondly, it blended in a lot more well than I thought it was going to. So in that instance, I substituted a clarinet part for a soprano saxophone part. And nobody did any different. Nobody had raised a stink about it. Nobody was none the wiser. So Yes, coming back to around what you were talking about, I think it's absolutely more than acceptable and fine and dandy to take something that was written for one instrument and play it on another. Why not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you often, I'm curious, this is kind of ad lib, but I'm thinking too, like the other day when I was practicing, I think I was in the higher second octave, third octave, and working on articulation, and Eric comes in and he's like, you kind of sounded like a xylophone or a marimba. And I thought, oh, I like that. I get really excited when other instruments can pick up timbre and
Totally.
steal from another instrument. I think that's a compliment when somebody can say,
I
oh,
agree.
wow, the low register of the flute almost sounds velvety like an oboe or a clarinet. And I think that's a huge compliment. So knowing like how to produce a good tone on sax, oboe, bassoon, flute, clarinet, etc., do you often play with that, with the color changes from one instrument to the next?
I do. I kind of go in with sort of a mindset already, what I want each horn to kind of sound like. So like, for instance, for saxophone, I mean, it's going to sound like a saxophone at the end of the day. And especially for my classical stuff, I try to sound as close to a viola or a violin in it as I can. And I think that might just be that's probably just a personal preference. Some of the artists that I've listened to, you know, sometimes do a really good job of capturing that. And that kind of, to me, like you said, it's complimentary.
Mm-hmm.
I want to sound like that. So naturally, I listen to them. I play along with them until I can get that sort of little nuance down. And then I just kind of go on about my day.
Nice.
Yeah, with clarinet, you know, I kind of like to think, you know, I think of like a warm, cozy cottage. I'm a very visual type person, and, you know, kind of thinking about like a nice little warm, cozy cottage with, you know, a wood burning stove. And, you know, you can kind of hear the pop and crackle of the wood in the fire. And I don't know, you can smell muffins and tea or whatever. You know, you can just kind of create your own scenario from there.
Yeah.
I sort of get that imagery in my head, and that's really just kind of the sound that I go for. And for flute, you know, I kind of have to go with Eric Dolphy on this one. And I think of bird songs. Eric Dolphy was a famous jazz saxophonist, often undersung, but was also a pioneer in the free jazz movement. Also a very, very, very good doubler on bass clarinet and flute. He would go out and he would transcribe bird songs with his flute. And a lot of his stuff, you can totally hear that. I mean, I wish I had, you know, a direct source queued up where I can back that up. But it's true. Google Eric Dolphy bird songs. You'll find it.
Wow. I have a mockingbird that sits out my window, and I, the flutist, have named her Melody, and it's so cliche, but I mean, her melody is just gorgeous, and it's always changing. It's not the same tune every day, and so I'm just imagining myself having to dictate melody. And
Right.
it would be a nightmare because she gets super creative with her chirps. I like to name my birds. Remember my bird, Thumbelina, I've always talked about?
I do, yeah.
She was a barn swallow.
Okay.
Out in a Haltom City where Eric and I lived before coming to Tech, and she was my favorite. She had the same cadence. At the end of every song, she ended the same. And I'll have to put a link in the show notes for listeners. There's YouTube bird songs, like videos that people capture. And I found one that's really good, and it depicts barn swallow's songs so well, and you hear that cadence and how she ends it the same every time. It's fascinating to me. I don't know if it's because I am a flutist, but I do love nature, so I think that's why.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, so thanks for that background with your ideas on how each instrument, how you envision the timbres sounding. That's really cool. So let's talk about specific advice for multi-instrumentalists who need help switching from flute to sax and flute to clarinet.
Sure. So one of the big things that I've noticed speaking with peers about, you know, they have to play this, you know, 16-bar flute thing that's in their chart. You know, what do I do? How do I go from saxophone to flute? Or, you know, on the opposite end of the spectrum, I remember one year we played Love of Moonlight musicals together, and you had saxophone parts in yours, even though I ended up playing them and it's not a big deal. But so the first thing you have to really take into consideration is the embouchure change. So for saxophone, it's going to be, a firm, not tight. One thing that you can do is take your thumb and right there at the base of your cuticle, just roll your bottom lip over your teeth and just set your cuticle right there and just sort of close your mouth around your thumb. Now you're going to want to kind of point the corners of your mouth up, almost like if you're, having just like the smallest little smile on your face, and then remove your thumb. And then that's sort of like the basis for a starting saxophone embouchure. For clarinet, the same principle applies, placing the thumb cuticle right there at the base of the teeth. But instead of, keeping the corners of your mouth into a smile, you're almost going to want to make like a frown face. Those two right there will sort of get you set up for a foundation of some kind from going from saxophone to clarinet. Another would be find a friend who is either a saxophonist or a clarinetist. Kind of pick their brain about, how do I make that work? How do you make this work? What can you tell me how I can get this to make this work? Or even, better yet, find somebody in the area, even if they live, 2 towns away, email them. Use people as a resource, absolutely. I think after you kind of acquire this sort of information from peers and instructors, the next thing you should do is invest in a mirror. The mirror is your best friend because it will never, ever lie to you. It will show you absolutely any and all imperfections that you might be experiencing. For instance, like moving from flute to saxophone, a common issue will be bunching up in your chin, and your chin will kind of look like a golf ball. Even though it might not necessarily feel like that's what is happening, the mirror will tell you this is exactly what's happening. So, and if you're going from flute to bassoon, it's going to be a completely different animal than those two. With bassoon, I kind of like to have what I call an over-under embouchure, where my top teeth are slightly in front of my bottom teeth. It's almost like an overbite. I guess I could call it just an overbite embouchure. But you're going to want to make sure that both lips are tucked in over the teeth, and that's always where I start.
Okay.
Is setting up the embouchure. And then, that kind of, for me, segues into what can I do to make the sound now? And I mean, there are a number of different things that you can do. I'm a big, big fan and advocate of long tones. I think that, if setting the embouchure is getting the foundation laid, or at least getting the blueprints drawn up, doing long tones is going to set the foundation. That's going to be the cement pour right there. I always usually try to start any playing day out with, nowadays it's more like around 3 to 5 minutes of long tones. But when I was really, really practicing, 8 hours a day kind of stuff, and again, really, really focused in on sounding like a more mature player, it was long tones all day, every day. And in particular, one thing that you can do is isolated long tones. I say isolated, meaning instead of doing long tones on the horn itself, I use just, so like a flute head joint or, saxophone and clarinet mouthpieces, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I say isolated long tones, I mean with saxophone and clarinet mouthpieces and a flute head joint.
Okay.
So that kind of really sets the stage for success.
That makes sense because, with my 6th graders who have no musical background or no flute background, and I'm just teaching them the proper setup of the flute embouchure, I'm having them work, going back to what you said, with the thumb, I'm having them work with just their finger on their chin, for a while, and using the mirror, like you said, the mirror is your best friend, and placing that finger right underneath the pink of the bottom lip and having them work with that bottom lip, corners are down like you're frowning, and then working on that top lip and saying poo and getting the aperture nice and small and blowing against their finger because they can feel it. So I can see a lot of parallels there. And then with what you just said with just the head joint or the mouthpiece, taking away the entire body, ignoring all the keys and bolts and widgets and whatnot, and just working with the actual, where the tone's being produced, that mouthpiece or head joint, and working with the lips and the air and concentrating on that area, I think that is crucial.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just because, it's going to set you up for a good time,
Yeah.
as opposed to just, diving in head first, without your goggles on, you're going to get chlorine in your eyes and it's going to sting. But if you, take the extra couple of minutes to get your goggles on there and adjusted and make sure that, there's not going to be any leaks, then everything could be, it could be a fun day.
I love that analogy. Yeah, nobody wants chlorine in their eyes. That's not fun. You're going to get red, bloodshot eyes, and then you can't see the pretty coral or, all the change at the bottom of the pool.
Right, exactly.
No, those are really great tips. Thank you for that.
Oh, yeah.
Just, going back to basics, like using the mirror. I use the mirror, and I've been playing flute for 20 years now, and I have to use the mirror every day just to kind of check to see what's going on. Of course, we want to use our ears because we're checking the sound. But if you need to know what's going on visually to see if there's something weird with your lip or something funky with your body that's creating tension or whatnot, that could affect the sound, then why not use the mirror?
Right. And going back to basics is just, I feel like a lot of folks our age are almost embarrassed to do that. Mm-hmm. Because by now, we're professional musicians. Mm-hmm. I don't need to go back to basics. I haven't done those in years. Why should I start back doing that again? Mm-hmm. Well, that's going to solve a lot of your problems if you are having problems. You have to retrace your steps and go back to the scene of the crime first. Mm-hmm. I don't understand people who shy away from going back to basics because that's almost always where the problem. Mm-hmm. So,
and even just being okay with that and being vulnerable to going into that space, you never know. You could come out with some new ideas and formulate some, hypotheses here or there about something that you never thought or dreamt in a million years you would approach it in such a way. You never know what could happen, basically like being a chef in the kitchen, playing with new spices or whatnot and, seeing what's up.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This year was basically going back to basics for me because I chose to do Invisalign for health reasons. And I, for quite some time, not even half a second, for many seconds, I freaked out. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm this quote unquote professional. I just got my degree. There's no way. I don't want to ruin my sound. And if anything, it was probably the best decision I've ever made because I had to. It forced me to get really curious. Going back to that word from the beginning of the interview, I had to get really curious, and I have learned so much about air and air production and what our body does and the placement of the tongue because I have to get creative with where I'm tonguing now because I have this thick plastic in my mouth. And you probably can tell, but I'm lisping all over the place. And so it's putting me in this situation where I'm just like, okay, well, this is where I'm at. And it's very freeing almost.
I agree with that. Yeah, you almost have to kind of, instead of saying, oh, well, that's it, that was fun to do for a few years. Now it's time to find something else. You do have to find a way to make it work. Mm-hmm. You might find something that, I used to do this, but now I'm doing this because I have to make a sound on the instrument. This actually feels a little bit easier than what I was doing. Mm-hmm. Or this feels a little bit different, but not necessarily in a bad way. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, absolutely, doors open, the mind gets going again. It's a really cool thing, I think.
Yeah, and there's a lot of surprises along the way, and I think that makes everything more fun.
Absolutely.
Cool. So I think you wanted to play something for us where, again, going with these tips and suggestions for doublers, could you play an exercise that helps you transition from X to Y instrument?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So what I've got, basically I'm going to just kind of start out, with my saxophone setup. I'll start out with just the mouthpiece. And what we always want to do is we want to buzz an A concert on our mouthpiece.
Okay.
Now, most of the time it's not going to come right out, but when you kind of learn a little bit more flexibility, the more often you do it, the easier it's going to become, just like anything that we practice or do. But one thing that you can do is, I always tell my students, put your back against the wall, kind of get your feet about shoulder width apart, a slight bend in your knees, put your hand on your stomach, right or left, it doesn't matter, whatever hand you're not holding the mouthpiece with. And you always breathe in through the stomach. That's a fundamental thing, right? Now, when you get a good grasp on the mouthpiece pitch, or, playing on the mouthpiece in general, then you can go to the mouthpiece pitch. But for those who don't necessarily, like, as if, Heidi, if I were there right now, and you're doing mouthpiece pitch, I don't necessarily know that I would put mouthpiece pitch right out of the gate. I would put the mouthpiece on the neck, just because it offers a little bit more tubing. It's not going to be as resistant, but you also don't have to worry about, like you were saying, all the keys and bolts and bells and whistles and all that rickety-racketa. It's just, a small tube with a mouthpiece on the end. And for sake of argument, I've shown you absolutely everything that you need to do. Bottom lip over the teeth, corners of your mouth firm but not tight, all kind of up in a little smile. And then it's almost, just like with anything, you're shooting that cool, fast stream of air right out of your body and through the mouthpiece and neck. So for instance, here's, saxophone, mouthpiece on neck. Right?
Okay.
A pretty decent A flat, according to my total energy tuner. But, that's kind of sort of the idea. And I think that, when you get confident enough to where, okay, I can make a sound on, the mouthpiece and neck all day, I'm going to go ahead and try the mouthpiece pitch now. So again, standing against the wall is great when you're first learning this. When you get more comfortable with it, then you can sit down, you can, just kind of sort of make this part of your daily routine. Sit at your coffee table, have your coffee, read the paper, do your mouthpiece pitch exercises, right? So going from, you're going to want to apply the exact same principle to just the mouthpiece as you would to the mouthpiece in the neck. Again, this is something that you shouldn't be afraid of. It's not going to bite you. It's not going to do anything. It's an inanimate object. So here is, a sort of a small demonstration of a mouthpiece pitch for alto saxophone. Again, I did not play it for that long for obvious reasons. It's a fun way to annoy your parents and your friends and your neighbors and everything like that. So, if you have a quiet space like a garage or, a practice room up at school, that would obviously be the most ideal place to do that. Now, going to flute, I have just the head joint, and I've got my right hand up against the opening of the head joint that slides into the body. And again, I'm just kind of looking for a central pitch to make. And again, I've chosen a concert A. That seems to resonate very well with me. And then having the tuner out helps, because that sort of helps you realize what you need to do. Do I need to tilt my nose up a little bit more because I'm a little flat? Or do I need to tilt my nose down because I'm a little sharp? That kind of thing. And I think when you do that long enough, you sort of get that muscle memory takes over. That way, when you're right up to your face, oh, okay, there I am. I'm there. Boom. Here we go. So going from saxophone to flute. Actually, that came out in E this time, but that's okay. Okay, we're going to have to put that last part. Because earlier today, I was not putting my hand over the part that goes into the head joint. And I don't know why I thought I was doing that for this second. So when transitioning from saxophone to flute, usually I just like to take, again, just the head joint. And, don't cover anything on that. Just hold it with both hands. 6 fingers is really all you need. What I like to do to kind of keep everything in check is a coffee stirrer or a toothpick. And I just kind of put that, wrap my lips around that and slowly take it away. And that sort of pinhole embouchure is really what I've been going after. That's what I've been taught. Heidi, I know that you said that, you kind of want to keep the corners of your mouth pointed more down, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Whereas I was told, either flat in an E syllable or slightly up. Again, I think that's a personal, pedagogue preference. But
in general, for like flute embouchure, we always have to, of course, my disclaimer is working with everyone's lip shape is different. Some of us are going to have thicker bottom lips. Some of us will have thicker top lips. Some have teardrops. Some do not. So putting that out there, I think, is important because everyone's individual makeup is different. With the smiling embouchure, if the corners are coming back a little bit, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I heard you say that was appropriate for saxophone.
Correct.
Okay, so with us, if we are smiling, my understanding is if the corners are back and, up, like you're smiling, then to me, that translates that my top lip, my lips are kind of being pulled against my teeth. Mm-hmm. They're going towards my ears. But if my corners are down, I'm saying poo, and everything is more forward, like I'm giving my mom a kiss, then the lips are away from my teeth. And I think that's what we're kind of ideally going for as flutists because we don't have a mouthpiece, right? So we have to create those octave register changes with our lips and the air direction. And I think if things are too pulled back, then we don't have that flexibility for such things. And not even octave register changes, but also intonation.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of what I mean by corners down. Yeah.
And see, even I learned something today.
There you go. See, yeah.
This is people helping people.
Yep, exactly. We're always learning. And I think that's so important for students to know. Here we are, we've met at graduate school and been playing instruments for X amount of years and we're still learning, and even me saying and vocalizing those ideas out loud, it's totally different than, just observing and think internally inside your head. But if you're actually externally having to express that, how do we as educators express that in such a simple manner and understandable way for students to digest?
Right.
Because you can get way too pedagogical, where it's just like, okay, you lost me.
Right, yeah, I'm really trying to avoid going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So, again, and I don't know, this might be something that you try with your students or not. I'm certainly not going to take any claims on, well, I did this. I started doing this, blah, blah, blah. I like to take the flute head joint, in both hands, and I like to try to, produce that concert A again. Again, A just resonates really well with me. I found that it sets me up for playing appropriately and correctly on saxophone and flute in particular. I'll get to clarinet here in just a second. But again, just the flute head joint. You've got your embouchure set, and you just have your tuner out and your mirror, right in front of you, and you just kind of play around with it. So what I did there was intentional on, and I know a lot of people are listening will be like, oh yeah, I'm sure he did that intentionally. I did start out a little high so I could kind of bring the pitch down right to about where it needed to, and then I tilted my nose a little bit even further to go a little bit more flat, and then ultimately just, I stopped, of course. But just to kind of show that, flute can be a little bit more sensitive, I think, than, reed instrument mouthpieces. And maybe it's because I'm a reed instrument person, necessarily a flute person, but I have found that by doing that, I usually do that, any of these transitional kind of long tone exercises, again, just using the mouthpiece or head joint about 2 to 5 minutes, and then you can ultimately put it together, and so you'll actually be able to feel that, oh, okay, this feels right. And I can't stress this enough, when you put everything together, you have to pretend that you're still only playing on either the head joint or the mouthpiece. Just because if you still have that same mindset, because when you just have the head joint or the mouthpiece, you're still putting that fast, cool stream of air through that because you want to make the sound. And, maybe you can get a twofer and you'll get the pitch correct also. So by doing that, putting the whole horn together and playing that way, you'll be very, very surprised with what you get. And this is just kind of like, sort of an example. So I was a little bit buzzy there at first, but once I kind of started to settle in, I knew that, okay, I've got this now. And I'm not expecting it to be perfect because I'm not a flute. I don't have a master's degree in flute. I don't even have an undergraduate degree in flute. But, I took enough lessons to where I know what I need to do. And it's just a matter of, putting in the hard work to do that. Nice. Now, for clarinet's a little bit differently, works a little bit differently. Like I said, for the embouchure, you'll want the corners of your mouth to be pointed down almost into like a sort of a frown, sad face, crying clown type thing. But instead of an A, I usually aim for about a B flat. A B flat to me, that feels right. Whenever I think about clarinet and I'm playing it, I'm like, boom, this feels right. This feels exactly how it needs to feel to me, for me to make this noise. For those of you out there listening, it might be a little bit different. Again, just find a friend or a teacher who can put you in the right direction, and then take what they have to say and absolutely apply it, and then also take your own comfortability in the play. So again, with clarinet, I like to aim for a B flat. Right there. A little bit high, but it's still a B flat nonetheless. And then whenever I put everything together, it all just, it feels like everything has just kind of come together for that. So it's like, and watching that on my Total Energy tuner, I was not necessarily pegged out sharp or flat in either direction. I was maybe a couple of cents sharp on the top note, maybe a few cents flat on the bottom note. I mean, overall, it was not an offensive amount. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that I like to do is mouthpiece head joint type isolation. Once you've got that really warmed up with, you've got it really rocking and rolling, and then I like to move on to, I'm not going to demonstrate it on all instruments, but an open fifths sort of interval exercise that I do. And I'm just going to demonstrate on clarinet because it's the closest one to me now. So you take a note, we'll just start on an open G, and then you'll hold that for a second, or, for a few beats, you'll go down to the D below the staff, and then ultimately down to the G below that. So it's going to sound. Doing that, in a chromatic fashion, really, it shows you the tendencies of the notes, but also, again, it's just a great long tone exercise that I like to do. If my bassoon was not in the top, I feel like it works really, really well for bassoon, just because bassoon can be a little bit finicky going from octave to octave, I've learned. So that's sort of really the particular exercises that I do when if I'm preparing for a show, for instance. Okay. The mouthpiece head joint isolation, the open fifth interval exercises, and then just chromatic long tones. Starting on your lowest note and playing until you are literally just sputtering out air and then just walking that up chromatically.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for all the attention to detail on your end. That's very helpful.
Oh, absolutely.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to jump to a question from my student, Olivia.
Okay.
And maybe, I know she's not here and you can't evaluate her in person, but maybe this question will make sense over the air. She says, I have a lot of problems with moving from saxophone to flute because my mouth feels tight, especially when I move out of the middle register and into the high register. Until I warm up more, the notes will come out thin and airy.
Okay, so I guess from that, we can assume that, when she warms up, everything sounds like it is fine.
Okay.
But until then, everything comes out thin and airy. So, I mean, my advice would be warm up more.
Okay, fair.
So, I hate to sound like a jerk, but it's absolutely true. And I remember when I was a high schooler moving from saxophone to flute, I had the exact same problems.
Okay.
Everything came out very thin, or it just didn't come out at all. And it really what it boils down to is practicing moving between the two.
Okay.
Again, I think that the head joint mouthpiece isolation work is crucial for this, because it will help solidify that muscle memory that's going to set you up for success rather than failure. That and just playing more flute.
Yeah. Perfect. My guess is, I'm not a saxophonist, but my guess is she might be too tight on the saxophone mouthpiece.
Yep.
And then when she goes over to flute, that needs a little bit more of a flexible embouchure. I think that's where her problem lies.
I think you're absolutely 110% correct about that.
Okay.
That was also one thing that I had to learn going from saxophone to flute. I had to learn to relax different muscles in my face, for flute to sound like a flute and not like a sputtering, pipe.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So definitely does sound like she might be, either a little too tight on saxophone. We don't know. She might be, biting the reed. I assume that's probably not the case.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, being too tight is not good at all.
Okay.
Just relax a little bit.
Perfect. So the last segment of the show, we do a portion called Picks. Do you have any picks for the listeners today?
I'll tell you what. I have been doing a lot of listening lately to this new jazz saxophonist that I've been introduced to named Adam Larson, and he's just killing it. I mean, he's ridiculous.
Adam Larson?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's for all you saxophonists out there. If you want to feel really bad about yourself really quick, go listen to him. But in the best way, because, I mean, he's a phenomenal player.
Uh-huh. I can hear Eric telling me, because whenever I hear our flute, god or goddess that we look up to, one of them is Emmanuel Pahud, and whenever, I hear him, I think the same, like what you just said. Oh, if you want to feel bad about yourself, go listen to Emmanuel Pahud. But the person that I'm married to is such an optimist, and he will say, no, Heidi, don't look at it that way. Look at it as he has proven that it can be done.
It's true. Absolutely.
Yeah. I have to insert Eric in there because it just seems like a very Eric thing to say. And he's rolling his eyes at me right now.
Absolutely. It does sound like a very Eric thing to say.
It does. Oh, thanks for that that performer suggestion. Is there a particular album that you have in mind?
Just the two that he has on iTunes, Simple Beauty and Selective Amnesia, are just amazing.
Very creative titles.
I know. I mean, and even more creative track names, too.
Yeah.
So.
I love it when people are so colorful like that. I'm like, oh, my brain doesn't work like that. Even listening to you talking about the clarinet sound in this warm, wooded cottage with tea and this and that. I'm like, oh, sign me up for that. That sounds amazing.
Right. And that's what I'll ask my students if they're playing, like the Glasnoff Concerto or something. We're like, what do you hear? What does this sound like to you? I don't know. Well, okay, let's play it again. Okay, now what does it sound like to you? It sounds maybe a little bit, like triumphant. Okay, we can work with that. Think about like, in the Odyssey when Homer comes back or Odysseus comes back and everybody is, cheering and carrying him through the streets and blah, blah. That's kind of, whatever. I try to get my students, if my students can paint a picture with what they're hearing, then I think that, a good portion of the work is done. Because if they can play all the notes, but they're not conceptualizing anything, then what are we doing?
Right. Even in my warm-up session yesterday, I literally had to imagine fireflies bouncing off of lily pads at nighttime with, the water being very crystal clear. And then the next minute it was fairy godmother from Cinderella doing her hocus pocus wand with the sparklers coming off the tip of it. And I thought, okay. I was trying to think of everything that was sparkly and bouncy and light just to help my tone when I articulated. And all these images were coming into my mind. And I thought, that is really fun. I feel like a 6-year-old girl all over again with not a care in the world.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's so important to be able to do that. My favorite thing that Kellen Thomas, my favorite analogy of his was, if you have a jelly donut and you drop it into, a layer of confectioner's sugar, what happens? Like the sugar rushes up off and then just kind of slowly drifts back down. We were talking about articulation one day and he dropped that one on me and I was like, man, that's awesome. That is like such a perfect way to describe that.
I love it. Well, anything with sugar, I'm all for it.
Yeah, too, unfortunately.
Oh, shoot. Well, my 2 picks are non-music related, but that's okay. This is what's on my mind.
What do you got?
Dark chocolate with raspberries.
Okay.
It's from, you can get this flavor, I'm sure, with anything, but I like this specific brand titled or called Endangered Species. It gives some of the proceeds to endangered animals. So that specific one, dark chocolate with raspberries, I think it helps fund brown bears or black bears.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And then there's other ones like just dark chocolate, I think helps fund Black Panthers, and you get the gist. But I like knowing that some of my chocolate indulgence helps endangered species. And
dark chocolate is good for your body as well.
Yes, very much so. 70% or higher.
Right, right.
Yeah. After anything under that's going to get probably too much of the sugars, like the bad sugars that we don't want.
Yeah.
And my second pick is my favorite. It's Topo Chico carbonated mineral water. And it's my favorite because I like my sparkling water coming from a glass bottle. I think it holds the fizz better. And I think the Topo Chico brand in general is the fizziest if you really like sparkling water. So those are my 2 picks.
I agree. I'll open one of those up and, like 2 days later, it'll still be fizzy.
Yeah. Yes.
Have you had the twist of lime? That one's my favorite.
Is it? Now, see, I'm weird with flavors. If I'm doing a twist of lime, it's going to be from a lime.
Sure. No, understandable.
Yeah.
But, I don't know, the twist of lime is pretty spicy. And speaking of, I don't know if you use those Mios or not.
Mios?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, man. They've got, additives in there. They're sugar-free, but they have, added in sugar substitutes or whatever.
Okay.
But even still, like squirting a little bit of that in there, or even if you have essential oils like lemon, you want to do a drop or 2 in that in there. Oh my gosh, blast off. It's amazing.
I love dropping a couple drops of lemon essential oil into my water. It's great for your immune system.
Absolutely. And it's, just kind of tastes like just lemon juice. I love it. I'm a big fan of that too.
Perfect. Well, you have a wonderful rest of your Sunday afternoon, Jon, and thank you so much for your time, energy, and talents. And I so appreciate helping out the flute community and the doubler community. And I hope you have a great rest of your academic year.
Absolutely. Thank you, Heidi. I wish you all the best. Thank you again for having me on here. I hope that I was able to give some semblance of advice to anybody out there who's listening.
For sure. Oh, yes. There are a lot of tangible pieces of advice for doublers and people who are considering it.
Wonderful.
Great. You have a good day, Jon.
Thanks, Heidi. You too.
Bye-bye. Today's episode is sponsored by J&K Productions. They produce all of my episodes, from adding the intro and outro music to editing the audio and all post-production needs. Contact them for your next podcast project at jkproductions.media. Thank you for listening to the Flute 360 podcast. For more information, please visit HeidiKBegay.com. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review in the iTunes store. Let's talk about flute.